Okay, let's see if I can make this work. I was going to show a little bit about how I use my Big Shot with some of the different cutting plates. This right here is a precision plate. I've had this one for a little over a year, so it's become very used. When you get it, this is what all the information that's going to be written on this side of the plate, but you use it like this in your machine. Do not put it like this or you will mess it up. And it just goes on top of your multi-purpose platform, whether you have the long one like I have here or you have the older short one. The old short one I gave to my granddaughter when I gave her my old Big Shot, because this one came with when I bought the new Big Shot. So that's the only pad that I have right now, or plate. So I use the precision plate, and let's see. I'm actually going to work on a card. This is how I store my dies on magnetic sheets that fit into the pockets of the notebooks that I've showed before. So when I get done with this die, it'll go back on this sheet and it'll slip back down into the pocket. But because it was a bigger die, I just took the whole magnetic sheet out of the notebook. Now when I work with the smaller dies, I use my magnet strips that I glued onto the acrylic frame, and then it holds them up here on my table in place. Then when I'm done with them, they go back in the little pockets where they're supposed to be. So, since I'm actually going to make a card using this, and you want to have your die as close to the edge as you can get it, but because this is a straight edged die, you don't want to line it up straight. You want there to be a little bit of an angle so that you don't get as much resistance when you run it through the machine. I used to have an AccuCut, which is a larger commercial type machine, and that was how we had to run our dies through. And so learning with that one made it a little easier to then learn with this one. And you're going to hear cracking sounds. That's just all part of it. This is a very good quality steel thin metal die, and so it does take a little more exertive pressure to run that one through. Then, because this is such a big die, it just automatically kind of popped off the surface. But the first thing I do is actually flip my piece over and make sure all of my little parts have cut out. And this one did, because like I said, this is a pretty darn good die. Now, because this is the chicken wire, and I know I'm going to be using it in a specific project, see all these little hexagon shapes? You can use these to make so many additional patterns on a project. Now, I don't always keep this, because if I just needed a little hexagons, I can, cut a piece of this out and have them. But if you're limited with paper, or you cut this from a specialty paper, save these little pieces, because there's so many little things you can do with them. One cute thing to do is, if you have a small alphabet stamp set that will fit within the perimeter of that shape, you can stamp out names, you can stamp out greetings, sponge a little ink around the edge, you could raise it up on a little piece of foam or pop dot, and just add so many other elements from nothing but your little saved scraps from your piece. So I wanted to actually pop all these out so I could show you or give you an idea. I haven't decided the word I'm going to put on the card yet, but this is going to become my background. And I did it in white because I'm actually going to use Distress inks and color it to try to make it look like old wire. And I do that a lot just because I don't have a lot of colored cardstock. So now I'm going to take this rooster, and this is one of the dies that I got off eBay that I guess it came from China. I'm not sure. It came up in a link. I wanted it and I bought it. And so he's a little more detailed. So I'm going to run it through just until I know the die has come completely through the roller. Then I'm going to run it back through just to give that little extra. And then, of course, on the black, it is hard to see. But when I flip it over and I look, I can see right there at the edge of his wattle and beak area, it did not quite cut through. So I'm going to turn him a different direction, put him back in the machine, and run him back through. And by doing that, you have changed the pressure on your roller, and now I can see that it cut completely through. And then I have this little pokey tool, and I'm hoping I'm staying in frame on here. It's hard for me to see the camera and look down at what I'm doing. But I get a little section started, and then I just work all of his little thin, delicate parts out. And if you want to clean up your die now, you can, or you can stick it back on your little magnetic holder you've made and clean it up later. And most of these, I do have one of those die brushes, but most of this stuff pops out pretty well, so I don't really have to grab it and use it. But there, let me move that so you can see the black a little better. There is my rooster, and he is going to, like I said, this is going to go on the background of the card. Then the rooster is going to go on there. I'm not sure what color background I'm going to do yet. I haven't gotten that far. And then there's going to be some sort of wording, or I'm just not sure what I'm going to put there yet. But that's going to be the beginning of it. So I'll set that to the side because I know that's going to be one of the next things that I do. Now I'm going to take the base plate, or the precision plate up, take the thick pad up, and I'm going to put my clean, except I did mess up twice and had my die turned the wrong way, but it only has a couple little boo-boos on it, but I do try to keep one clear plate. And this is what those of us that have had these dies from Sizzix for years and years and years, we always call them by their color name. This was a red, there was yellow, which was about half the size, then the green ones were about a fourth of the size, and they would be various images. I only have a couple of the reds inside. Now I think they refer to them as Sizzix Originals because they've come out with so many other sizes. This particular one has 9 little bitty mini tags on it. I absolutely love this die, and I bought it for when I was making a lot of mini books, and I would make tags to go in the pockets. So the way you use this one, you set your die face up on your bottom cutting plate, cover it with your piece of cardstock, then use your cutting plate that you've been cutting into over the top and run it through the machine. And normally these dies, especially one like this, one pass is going to be adequate to cut everything out. Then you see you've got all these little shaped tags that you can then use in projects. Alright, say you only wanted to cut 1 or 2 of these. And these little things here, if they begin to get clogged, you just take your pokey tool and you can go back in and dig those out, because that hole doesn't go all the way through, so you can't push that through. And you can just relieve a few layers of it, and then you won't have that problem. But I don't know when the last time I ever cleaned that one out. So, but say you only wanted to cut like this row of these tags. So these were just some scraps of cardstock from where I cut some full sheets down. You do the same thing. Of course, I would have trimmed that a little smaller, but just to give you the idea. And then you run it through, and then you've got just the 3 shaped tags that you wanted, and you haven't wasted paper by cutting out shapes that you didn't want. So that's an advantage to a tag that has multiple, or a die that has multiple images on it. Like a tag die, you can get just the size that you want. All right, this is a, I'm not sure if this one was called a Biggs or not, but it's one of the newer model of Sizzix dies. And this particular one, it does a food jar and a spoon. It also has the little element that makes the little bitty box, but I seldom ever use that. I mostly cut just the spoon and the jar, and I do that by just trimming down a piece of paper that just fits that part of the die, and I cut it out. But I wanted to show you another thing you can do, and you use this die the same way as you did the red Sizzix die. So what I want to do is give myself an approximate double the length of this little jar right here. Then what I'm going to do is fold that piece of cardstock in half, and I'm going to line up that folded edge just inside the top cut line of that jar shape. Put my cutting pad on, and then when I run this through, it's going to, because it's a steel rule die, which means there's actually a steel blade embedded in that foam, and they will cut you if you're not careful. But now I have created not only my jar shape, but it's now hinged, and I didn't have to do anything else but just fold it, line it up to where it was just inside, because where that line is where my cut line is. So I line it just inside there, and there's my little jar. And wouldn't this be an adorable embellishment in a recipe book, cookbook, that you were making to put extra little notes about a recipe in? To die for. Okay, now we're going to use the same die, and I'm going to show you something a little different. All right, you cut your jar. And there's your little jar shape. But now you want to do the lid as a separate piece or a separate color. Let me get a scrap from over here, and I'm just going to grab whatever's handy, because I still can't do a whole heap of moving, so I try to work with what I can reach. Okay, now let's make sure that bottom cutting plate is under there. Now what you're going to do is you're going to line up your scrap just where the top of that jar is going to be at. Put your top plate on, cut it. Now you have created the top to your jar in a totally different color, where you can, I had that backwards, where you can decorate it, foo-foo it, whatever you want to do to it, and then there's an additional element. You could also do the same thing by just adding this to your folded piece if you wanted to. So that's just another way to utilize that particular shape die. Now you can do this. I have a jar that's one of the thin dies, and I've done the same thing with it. It's just lining that piece up. Okay, this is another one of the thick dies. It's the cookie jar, the Sizzix cookie jar die, which I absolutely love, and I was very blessed to have gotten it when I did, because now it seems they are very hard to find. So, I'm just going to cut down a piece of cardstock that I know will fit, and just to not have so much hanging off, we'll cut that, and same thing, run it through the machine. Now, what's nice about this, and I use this shape to decorate recipe cards, and I do a lot of little recipe books. But if you had a really pretty patterned paper, cut your jar out of that. Then you can go back and you can do the exact same thing. Let me get this little scrap of red here. Do the exact same thing, and you can make a top for your cookie jar from a contrasting piece of cardstock by lining this up at whatever point you want it to be on the jar lid. I'm going to come right to the top of the handles and get that back in place. Let's see, that might hang off a little long, so we can snip that. And if you need to use tape, and I don't know where mine is at, but it's the, I have mine in a tape dispenser. But if you get the Scotch removable tape, this stuff is awesome for sticking down and holding your dies to, or your paper onto your dies, especially when you're wanting to only cut certain little parts. But mine is buried over on a countertop and I can't get to it right now. So anyway, there is your jar top all cut out. And then you can decorate your project from there. So that's just how easy that is to do, and use multiples of shapes. Let's see, okay, this is, I just got this die the other day in. All right, and this is one where you have to have your multi-purpose platform, and then I'm going to use the precision base plate again, and let's see, let's get a piece trimmed down to fit it. And now this is a die that's got the crease lines already in there and then just cuts the outside edge. And when you're using this, you want to work with the die face down onto the surface. Then use the top plate. And like I said, that popping and cracking is normal. That's just what it does. And this die actually cuts very good. And you can see the score lines, but they are very, very light compared to when we score, like in our Martha Stewart scoreboard. So you want to be sure when you fold this die up, you really follow those score lines. If you get too fast in doing it, they will run off and kind of follow the grain of the paper, depending on if the score line goes this direction or this direction. So I have found that out, that when I work with these thin dies, to make sure that I have the score line right where it's supposed to be. Okay, then somebody else had asked me about using embossing folders. To use an embossing folder, each one of these little sheets on your multi-purpose platform kind of tells you what sandwich you're going to need for running it through the machine. So when you're using an embossing folder, and you'll see right here it has the picture of it, these two have to be moved out of the way. Now, in the real world, when I have plenty of room out in my studio, I have room to extend these out and I can run the die back and forth, or the plate. But my little table in here is actually too short to do that. Me not be able to put my hands on my, well, darn. The other time it's right there in my little stack. I moved it when I was rearranging. This is my base plate from the first Big Shot that I ever had. This was before they came out with this style of platform that had the pieces attached to it. But you could buy the different shims that went on top of it. So I have kept this all these years for using with my embossing folders in my machine. And you'll notice it says this side up, not a cutting surface. So you just put it in your machine, and I have a little dots folder. This was the first embossing folder I ever got, and it is still my absolute favorite embossing folder to use, because there's just something about those little random dots they go with everything. Oops, and I just put that in there backwards after I had it in there correctly. This goes on the bottom, then the bottom plate, then the embossing folder with the piece of cardstock in it, then your top one, and you run it through, and it does the embossing, just like that. So when I emboss, especially now that I just have this little kind of quickie setup in the house, I use this plate. But when I am out in my studio, I do flip this back, and especially if I'm going to run a couple of them through at the same time, because I actually have plates that are the same size as this. But I wasn't going to be cutting any of my big dies, so I didn't bring them in here. But that's the only time this plate ever gets used or brought out, is just for embossing with and on. If I can get this back up there. I still can't bend, lift, or twist, so I have to have things within arm's reach to grab a hold of them. Okay. This is just another thin metal die. Put the cardstock down. Put the design that I'm going to cut. Run it through the machine. Make sure everything cut apart. And it looks like it did. This is actually the first time I've run this die through, so I wasn't familiar with if I needed to do 2 passes on it or not. But if you're not sure, you can always do the 2 passes. It's not going to hurt anything as long as you have not jiggled or moved your machine. Okay, come on out of there. There we go. Okay. And then poke those through. And you could, depending on how you wanted to color an image like this, you could take this and use your inks to color it. You could go back and cut another one of these and another color of cardstock, snip the flowers off and do some layering, then color your greenery or your foliage. So there's a lot of uses and variations that you can use with this die. But say, for example, you only wanted to use part of it. Then you would just come in here and you could snip off just the part you wanted to use, and you could add another leaf to that, or you could leave it like it is and you could still use that to embellish a really small project. Same thing here. If you wanted to just use this, let's see, I would probably trim it right there. And then I would clean that up with my little detail scissors, and there would be another little tiny element. So there's, out of one die, you've basically created 3 little elements you can use on projects just by breaking it down and using the parts of it or the pieces of it. And you don't have to, like, you could cut one instead of going, oh, well, I only want that flower. Cut it apart, and what I do is I have a little tray here, And I call these my cutoff pieces. And anything I'm not sure about, or I only used part of it in a project, or I cut it and then I wasn't sure about using it, I put them in this little tray, and then I will go back and I'll dig through this and I'll see if there's anything I can use in something else to then add it to a project. So for now, that's where those will go until I'm ready to use them. So I hope that helped answer some questions, and I hope I was able to cover enough of it. And if not, y'all can fuss at me and let me know. Thanks. Bye, y'all.